And welcome to another exciting episode of Books with Bridgetti. I'm your host, Bridgetti Lim Banda from Cape Town in South Africa, and today we have the pleasure of hosting the amazing Andrew Pessin. He's a professor of philosophy at the Connecticut College, and he's also the author of multiple acclaimed books and former genius of The Late Show with David Letterman. We'll explore Andrew's captivating new novel today, Bright College Years, which takes us back to the nostalgic and transformative years at Yale University in the 1980s, our favorite time. Authors like you've never heard them before, only on Books with Bridgetti. Don't go away, we'll be right back.
Introducing Books with Bridgetti, a lineup of industry experts, award-winning authors and talented indie authors. Buckle up for an unparalleled journey with us. Meet exceptional authors celebrated globally for their captivating narratives. Our authors craft imaginative stories that stay etched in your mind long after the final page. It's not just stories, it's lingering experiences that stay etched in your mind. Our authors share the inspirations that create mesmerizing page-turning stories. Journeys that embody resilience, that turn setbacks into stepping stones, rejections that spark growth, and hurdles that become a catalyst for creativity. From dramas, mysteries, fantasies, children's stories to reality stories, join us as we delve into the inspiration behind the story, discover how authors breathe life into characters, and meticulously craft plots that keep you turning the page. But wait, there's more. We share stories from indie authors as well as Amazon and New York Times best-selling authors. Get ready for an interview that'll have you on the edge of your seat. Stay tuned. Join us, only on Books with Bridgetti.
If you have just joined us, welcome to Books with Bridgetti. Our live stream is made possible by StreamYard and BeLive Media. In today's show, we talk to Andrew Pessin, authors like you've never heard them before, only on Books with Bridgetti. Now, if you've never met Andrew yet, he is a professor, an author, and a philosopher who has written extensively on philosophy and fiction. His latest book, Bright College Years, is a coming-of-age story set in the 1980s at Yale University. So join us as we delve into his latest book, Bright College Years, and explore the complexities of life, friendship, and growth. Andrew, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and a privilege and a thrill to be with you today. Thank you for having me.
I'm absolutely delighted. I'm going to jump right in because time, as I've learned over the years, go by way too quickly, and I always have way too many questions.
And I, as a professor, have way too much to say, so let's go for it.
We'll have to strike a balance somehow.
That's right. Feel free to cut me off at any time. If I'm going on, that's what my students do. They start going, neck cut there. Happy to oblige.
Oh, my goodness. Andrew, how have your experiences at Yale influenced the narrative of Bright College Years?
Oh, let's start with a big, heavy question. Why don't you? Well, happily, this is my fourth novel. It was always my dream in younger days to write novels, but I had a long detour through a PhD, philosophy, college professorship, that sort of thing, and only came back to it about 10 years ago. And unlike my previous novels, or at least two of my three previous novels, where I really had to invent a plot, this one, happily, I didn't have to invent all that much of. If you ask how the life experiences shape this narrative, well, I would say 90% of the episodes and incidents in the novel are true stories. This captures at least the experience from my point of view of a particular gang of people in the coming of age, as you said earlier, in the early 1980s. So I had a lot of real material to work with. There was certainly fictionalizing of details and moving pieces around and adding some as well. But overall, the narrative as you read it is roughly the narrative of my college experience.
Okay, now I admittedly loved the 80s. So what inspired you to set the novel during the 1980s, and how does that time period impact the overall storyline?
You are starting. These are big questions. So I want to praise myself for my short answer to the previous question. This one might not be quite as short. So this novel came into being. You and your audience are among the few people who now know the following, that my 4 novels actually fit together into a kind of meta structure. So to fully understand each one, may I commend to you my other novels as well. They each can, of course, are self-standing and can be read on their own, but they fit into this larger picture. And so this novel in its genesis was to advance that larger picture in a certain way. And it's about the death or murder of a particular character. And as I began writing the novel about that murder and getting deeper into it, I realized in order to understand that murder, and ultimately there'll be a mystery element, because the question will be who's responsible for that murder, obviously. But in order to understand that murder, we had to go back in time to a previous stage of that character's life, and the stage that made the most sense, in fact, was necessitated were those college years. So what brought me back to the 1980s was really the necessity of this plot, laying the grounds for, and if those who've read Bright College Years will notice, you don't solve the mystery of the murder in this book. That's still going to be the next novel, so you've got a reason to come back for more. But so the focus became these very, I think you said earlier, formative or transformative years. So it was the necessity of the plot that brought me specifically back to the 80s. They also say, write what you know, and that is my coming of age period, as it turns out. And so I was very comfortable and familiar with that period. At the same time, I think you also used the word nostalgic. There's something about spending time reflecting on on a past period of your life that's it's very moving. So it was a lot of fun and really moving to write this novel. Of course, my memory is less than perfect, being of the age that I am. But so I did quite a bit of research, reminding myself of the things that were going on in the early 80s, both in the world and in particular at Yale University, which is the primary setting of the novel. I read every single edition of the student newspaper, the Yale Daily News, from my matriculation to my graduation, to be sort of reminded and brought back into that period. So it was a lot of fun that part was a little onerous, but it was a lot of fun overall to just go back to that period. And there's a lot of interesting things going on in the world and in me personally in those early 80s.
I'm sure, and sadly, our memories are not quite what it used to be.
They are not. And the advantage, though, of course, is our memories are creative. I discovered things that I had misremembered. I had told other stories. And in fact, I just recently had my college reunion of many of the same people who are roughly the basis for the characters in this novel. And I had the very delightful following experience. There's a particular story that I remember of myself that is in the novel. In fact, it's been practically in the opening pages of the novel. And over the years, I've become not so sure if that story actually really happened. I started to question it. Did I make that up? Did it happen to someone else? And I mentioned that story, and it's not a spoiler. It's early in the novel. The character is a freshman when first arriving on campus in the opening days. Well, it turns out the dean of his college married a much, much younger woman. And that woman, I thought, was just one of our fellow students. And so I tried to pick her up, not once, but twice. And the funny part of that is the first time I tried to pick her up, she explained very clearly that she was the dean's wife and not appropriate. And I didn't believe her, which is why I tried again a second time. So I remember that story, but then I started questioning it. And at the college reunion, I mentioned it to one of my friends I haven't seen. He said, that's not only is that story true, he said, I was there. I witnessed it. I saw you trying to do that. And it was like, oh, yeah.
Hilarious.
External validation of this sort of hazy memory of mine.
Goodness, that is funny.
Yeah.
Wow. Can you tell us a little bit about the significance of the title,
Yes.
Bright College Years? and its relevance to the themes throughout the book?
Yes, wonderful question. Thank you for that. Well, the simple answer is that the Yale alma mater, literally the song, how many times do you sing your college's alma mater, especially if you go to like the sporting events of your college, which I did. You sing the Yale, your alma mater on a regular basis. You sing it at every reunion. So the Yale alma mater is called Bright College Years. And in fact, it's a beautiful alma mater. It's not that I don't know a whole lot of other colleges. I know a few, and at least the ones I've seen, I objectively believe the Yale one is superior. I did include it in the front and back covers of the book for people to check out, but it's a beautiful song. It doesn't have the melody, but the words just so capture the poignancy of these years, in particular from the perspective of looking back on those years. So Bright College Years, as we all know, when you look back on things, and we were talking about memory just a moment ago, when you look back on things, sometimes you invent things, obviously you forget things, but you tell new stories about all the events of those years. You develop a narrative about them, and that narrative is obviously informed by the years that happen after those years as you come to understand new things. And that's a long way of saying what I could say a lot more succinctly, namely that the nostalgia gives this kind of glow to the things we're nostalgic about. We remember fondly those years. And the reality is, when you go back day by day, when you're living those years, there's many wonderful things. Don't get me wrong. My college experience had a lot of wonderful things, but there were a lot of difficult things, stressful things, very, very painful things, one of which is part of the story of the novel. It wasn't all roses back then. And yet, when I look back from this distance, they are very bright college years, as if it's got this rosy glow that sort of surrounds the whole thing. So Bright College Years is not only an excellent alma mater that really captures the college experience, but also captures this nostalgic looking back that gives everything a glow, which is wonderful, even if it's not necessarily accurate, right? These were stressful, difficult, challenging times also, even though that's not how we often remember them.
I'm sure. Now, Andrew, the next question I couldn't resist, because yesterday we had an author and he went from technical writing to novels. So my question to you is, how did you transition from academic writing to novels?
So I assume he did that successfully, right? You wouldn't have had him on your show was he not successful. That's a great question too. I see why your show is so excellent. These questions are wonderful. Well, the question assumes I've done this successfully, and I think I have. I think I have. I really think it uses, just on the one hand, entirely different parts of the brain. And I know that's a metaphor. I don't have any idea what parts of my brain are engaged when I'm doing things, but it just feels like an entirely different exercise. Not least, and if I think more about it, I could probably start comparing and contrasting them a little bit, but not least because when I do my academic writing, which is primarily philosophy, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about that if you like, the goal is, first of all, to be clear. I think that should be a goal always, but the goal is, first of all, to be clear, but it's also to be logical and methodical in a certain way. When I'm doing philosophy, I'm trying to make an argument, and that means I'm trying to present points in a very specific order and manner in order to reach or produce some conclusion. It's a highly rational, logical process. But when when I am writing a novel, whatever clarity means, it means something a little bit different in a novel. But a novel, for me, there has to be an emotional component, passion that's through it. And what I'm trying to do is capture and express a set of feelings amongst other things as well. And that isn't a logical or rational process. And in the end, when I teach my students how to write well philosophically, at least as far as I conceive good writing in philosophy, I have a whole outline of how you have to figure out what each of your points is and what order they best go in to most effectively make your argument. And you have to literally be able to make an argument that this is the order those points should go in order to make your other argument. But when I'm writing a novel, it's none of that at all. It's really what feels right. I think that's the only words I have for it. What feels right? Does this scene work? And work isn't making a logical argument to a conclusion, but does it, A, move me first? I'm the first reader, obviously, of it, hopefully not the last, but the first reader. Does it move me in the way I want to be moved? And does it advance the plot in the way I want the plot to be advanced? But that is just not a logical process. So I really think it's just completely different parts of the brain are engaged in these processes. So it's not a matter of translating anything. It's a matter of, turn this off and turn that on.
Absolutely. Now, my next question, I'm sorry, but I could not resist needing to ask you this. Did your portrayal of the genius on the Late Show with David Letterman influence your writing career at all?
Did that influence? I assume, I don't know if your audience is particularly familiar, but David Letterman was a long-running late-night TV host, a comedian, etc. And I did have the amazing good fortune, and it was really just a lucky coincidence to end up portraying the genius on a series of skits that we filmed and showed on his show. And that had a nice amount of popularity back in the 90s. So I like to say I used up about 9 of my 15 minutes of fame being the genius back in the 90s. And it's allowed me ever since to milk it for 2 things. One, I can now tell people I'm not an actual genius. I just play one on TV. So that's a thrill. And 2, it's a fun little tidbit that gets people interested in my work. So certainly the practical way that it has influenced or at least helped my work, especially my non-academic work, my novels, is it's a little interesting tidbit that gets people interested typically in what I have to say. The downside, of course, is, if I present myself as an actual genius, then the bar is very high and I'm very likely to disappoint. So I'm sure I've done that along the way as well. I know that I'm very actually interested, switching gears slightly, I'm very interested in the idea or concept of genius or geniuses. And, like the way, and I would be lying if I said that I hadn't thought of the following, that in the same way that, Einstein's name becomes like a noun, are you an Einstein, right? Like, is it ever going to be the case that someday you're a Pessin? Like, that would be really pretty thrilling. Doesn't have the same ring, does it? Like, Einstein has just become a word of English as opposed to this guy's name. And there's something just, so powerful about that. But I know that in this novel, it takes place at Yale, which is one of the more prestigious schools in the United States, maybe ranking internationally as well.
Absolutely. So, I mean, everybody knows Yale.
Okay. I didn't want to presume anything because given you're in South Africa and listeners probably around the world. But yeah, it's a pretty prestigious place. And there's a lot of smart people there. And, my group of friends in particular, I hope none of them watch this, may not have been the Einsteins at Yale, but insofar as they were at Yale, they were, pretty smart compared to, I don't know, the average population. They were above average. Let's put it that way. Very, very nicely. But they were like scarily brilliant people, that one is associates with here, if one is not that oneself. I just remember that even the first week freshman year, after the dean's wife rejected me the first time, I think, I was in someone else's dorm room. And at the time, the main bell tower, there's this beautiful bell tower where the carillon is. And I became a carillonneur. So I played the carillon during my time at Yale. And that features in the novel as well. Some key scenes occur in the carillon or on top of the carillon. And at the time, that carillon was under renovation, so there was like a very complex scaffolding around the whole thing. And I remember going into some kid's room, and he had a poster which was a picture of the carillon, and then he had built, using toothpicks, an exact scale replica of the scaffolding around that entire thing. That must have taken, who knows how many hours that took him, and the engineering and the measurements, the way he got the glue to get the toothpicks to stick to that poster, and it was all to scale. I remember thinking, all right, he's a step above me there. That was really some achievement. And so it was filled with places like that. And I really am interested in and admire very intelligent people. So the characters in this novel are on average pretty intelligent. There's one in particular who's like extremely intelligent. And so it wouldn't surprise me if this fun little experience playing a fake genius on the David Letterman show helped get me intrigued in the idea of geniuses, and that influences at least one of the major characters of the novel.
Oh my goodness, I think you're reading my mind, because my next question is, In what ways does the character of Jeffrey reflect your own life or philosophical viewpoints?
Wonderful question. So, the big question, and indeed, as I mentioned, I just had my college reunion last weekend, week and a half ago, and a lot of people in that class. The novel is roughly about the Yale class of 1984, and in particular, the members who are sort of my gang are prominent in it. So the biggest question for all of them is like, which character is which person? And I do try to say, I mean, I believe it and it's true. I say to them, none of them is. They're all fictional characters, but many of them borrow things from real people. But you shouldn't, rather than think of, let's say, this character as Ed, think of this as a fictional character who borrows some things from Ed, but then also has things that aren't Ed, right? So they're all fictional characters. And several of them were not persuaded by that argument. But in any case, it really is true. That said, if there's a character who's most directly me, it is the Jeffrey character, and who is nicknamed or goes by the nickname Jeff throughout for reasons I could perhaps explain if you're interested. So that character is the most me, and his experiences are, a lot of them are borrowed from my experiences. But that said, I have to say, and I wonder if this is true of other authors. I mean, there's very talented authors who can create very different and vivid characters. Different people. They're completely different people, the characters they create. But I can't help but feel when I write anyway, maybe it's because I'm a lesser author, or maybe it's true of all authors, I don't know, that every one of the characters is a different aspect of me. Ultimately, I'm pouring myself into each one of these characters, and I'm working hard to distinguish them and differentiate them. A sign that, at least on my side, and you can tell me if you feel differently, but the sign that I felt I had succeeded, there's a certain point in writing the novel, once the characters had sort of crystallized in my mind, you get these phases where you feel like the novel's writing itself. I know exactly what Czar would say here. I know exactly what Croc would say, right? I know what they would say because they're distinct characters who have their personalities. And that's the moment when I feel like I'm getting successful. The characters have come alive, sort of almost independent of me. But again, that said, there's pieces of me in Czar, there's pieces of me in Croc, there's pieces of me in every character. And, if for those who've read the novel, Jeff, sort of the main character, and Jude, who is in many ways his main rival and also closest friend for an important part of it. I would say 90% of what Jude is the character who's sort of really philosophical about the world and has all these ideas and things. But most of those ideas really were my ideas. Like, those are things I used to think about and say in college. So Jeff is me. And Jude, who's a very different character from Jeff, is also me. And little bits of me are in the other characters. So Jeff is definitely the focal point, but all the characters have pieces or aspects of me.
Very interesting. Somebody said the other day, the nice thing about writing is that you can kill off people without having to go to jail.
Yeah. Yes. Well, there is a murder that is front and center in this novel that regrettably does not get solved in the novel. So, that murder is perhaps me killing off that person, right? It can be very, very satisfying. Let me just add a little bit to my previous answer. It might sound kind of narcissistic, right? I don't want to, it's not that. I mean, I'm very inspired by all the characters real people that I drew from, and real incidents, many of which didn't involve me. But I do wonder, be interesting to ask other authors this, even as they're inventing characters that are very different from them, does it feel like it's an aspect of them? I'm intrigued by that question.
I think that may well be true, from having interviewed so many different authors over the year. I think there definitely is some truth in that, and they can reinvent themselves through the characters and, change little tidbits, but there's a lot of truth in it that they alter somehow.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting journey. That's why I never get tired of interviewing authors, because every journey is so interesting and exciting for different reasons.
Yeah. I'm thinking, I'm going in a dark place for the moment, but authors who write like horror or violent things, which is not me, but you wonder, like, when they're inhabiting the character who's the bad guy in their novels, who's perpetrating acts of violence, like, is that satisfying something deep within? And I've recently been rereading some Freud for a side project, and Freud's all about the death instinct. We are driven both by eros, or love, and also death and destruction. That it's part of everybody's psyche to have some aspect, and hopefully decent people suppress that aspect of themselves and don't act on it. But I do wonder, authors or filmmakers who create scenes of violence, is it touching something deep inside them? And I probably shouldn't go further with that thought.
I've wondered about that often, and it's been an interesting journey listening to different horror writers as to why they got into horror. And it's always a very unique story. Some of them suffered from PTSD, and it's their way of dealing with it.
Interesting. Yeah.
But a lot of them, the horror writing is, on some level, I've seen a form of therapy, of dealing with something that happened in their past. I mean, the one that always stands out for me is one horror writer who is a theater nurse. And, she says while she's in the operating room, she's always thinking of interesting scenes. I'm like, oh my goodness, that sounds creepy.
It sounds creepy, but I also get it, because what you're doing is, it's a way of distancing yourself from what you're seeing. What you're seeing now becomes part of a story you're creating. It decreases the reality of it in a certain way for you. And I could see that even as a coping mechanism to help you confront what is obviously very, very difficult. Going to a lighter example, like one of the characters in the book has a lot of trouble getting a date, finding women, right? The Be-Me character. And, and to be fair, there's a lot of me in Be-Me too. And most of the experiences that he has, it's played for humor in the novel, his sort of almost pathetic attempts to get people to date him, which fail. But most of those experiences came from my own experiences. But what's wonderful 40 years later that I have this power, just as you said, like kill off a character, to kill someone without going to jail. I can process those unpleasant aspects of my earlier experience and A, make fun of them now, and B, I know now that they, produced a successful outcome, right? I landed very happily. I'm extremely happily married. It's like things are wonderful, wonderful. And now I can go back and look at those earlier episodes, which of course were painful at the time. And now they can A, be funny, and B, be meaningful, because what I understand, and this of course is the theme of the novel, is that all of those experiences helped shape me, produce the person who became the soulmate of the person who was my soulmate, right? Those experiences, those loser experiences, as we call, sort of call the person in the novel, those loser experiences, as painful and unpleasant as they were at the time, from the perspective of hindsight, are A, funny, and B, meaningful. And I can now see that they produce the person who's going to land well, as I am fortunate to have done. And if anything, that's probably the broadest, biggest theme of the novel. You mentioned coming of age, and yes, the college years obviously are kind of coming of age. You become an adult or a young adult during those ages. But the tagline of the novel, which I'm very, very proud of, I came up with it, is that coming of age doesn't only happen to the young. There's also this wisdom of hindsight. And this is why the novel is written by an older guy looking back. You process those events in new ways. You can extract lessons from them that were invisible to you at the time. Knowing how things end up allows you to cope and process those things in a new way when you didn't know how they were going to end up. And indeed, the theme of the novel is about the older person coming to terms with some of the complexities of the past as he reflects backwards. So that's a different kind of coming of age. The coming to terms with your earlier phase is the coming of age of an older person.
I like that. I really like that.
I do too. Thank you.
Andrew, can you elaborate a little bit on the role of friendship and rivalry in shaping the characters' journeys?
Yes, thank you for that question. If I had to choose one thing the book is about, it's about many things. But I just mentioned one, coming to terms and coming of age. But if I had to choose one thing, or tag, when you do a social media post, you're supposed to tag it with something. Probably friendship would be the most important thing. The bulk of it is about this group of friends, and it's obviously occurs through the perspective of the individual who's sort of the main character and narrator, because that's how we experience the world, through our first person experience of it. But it's about how each of these people connects to and relates to and grows through their relationships with each of these other people. Each of these other people is essential for the for each individual to become who they become eventually. So it's really about a collection of people connecting and relating. And, in particular, I've got this group of college friends that just, remarkably 4 decades later, practically daily, we have text chats. We're still making the same jokes in some cases that we made 40 years ago. The bonds that you form just become an essential part of who you are. And it was just so much fun to explore that theme by, of course, revisiting so many of the stories and incidents that created those bonds in the first place. In fact, one of the reviewers had a very nice line about it. I'm probably not going to get it exactly right, but he said something. He sort of summarized the novel. I don't know if he summarized the novel by saying something. It studies all the meaningless little episodes and incidents that together cumulatively become something profoundly meaningful, right? And if you think about the way one typically connects to one's college friends on any given day, nothing important's going on most days. Most days are ordinary days. You're studying, or even if you're having a party, it's just another party or a sports game or something along those lines. But somehow through those repeated interactions, especially with the same group of people, these bonds form, and the bonds are incredibly profoundly meaningful that shape who you are for the rest of your life. And so I wanted to capture that. I wanted to capture how friendships form and how friendships are essential for who we become.
Wow, quite amazing. How did
that sounded pretty heavy.
Very heavy.
Yeah. As a philosopher, I guess, but it's all true. But it's also driven not by the logic necessarily, but by the feelings, like the feelings you have for these people, right? And trying to capture those feelings.
Absolutely. How did you develop the ensemble cast in the book, and which character did you find was the most compelling?
That's like asking me to choose which of my children is my favorite child. Which, by the way, I can do. However, that's a joke. The ensemble, that's new for me. So this is my 4th novel. First novel was sort of about a dysfunctional family. Second novel is a historical murder mystery based closely on the tragic life and mysterious death of the world's most famous philosopher, René Descartes, the I think, therefore I am guy, whose work I studied very extensively as an academic. The third novel is a kind of academic satire about campuses going crazy, which unfortunately has proved to be a little prophetic if you want to steer in that direction. So all of those were much more focused on a small group of people, like a family, or a particular individual. This is my first attempt to write something like an ensemble cast, and it's not easy. In particular, one of the challenges of an ensemble cast is you have to introduce a lot of characters to the reader, and it's hard for a reader. And I know this from reading other books, right? It's hard for a reader to keep track of a whole bunch of different characters. And so I don't know if I did that successfully. I feel it was reasonably successful, but in the first part of the book, you do get introduced to most of them, and then there's a few others that get added in later once the other ones are established. So the challenge of writing an ensemble was a difficult one, but also part of my own philosophy and strategy about writing novels is I want to grow with each novel. I want to try something new, the first novel, Dysfunctional Family, took place roughly from the 1950s to the 1980s. The historical murder mystery was in the 17th century. The campus satire, Nevergreen, was very contemporary. And this novel is primarily 1980s ensemble, connecting to, of course, it's looking back. So it's contemporary looking back, but the bulk of it is the 1980s, as we started with. So each novel, I want to try to do something different. I want to try to grow. So it was an exciting challenge to do the ensemble thing. And as far as the most compelling character, well, of course, I should naturally say Jeffrey, because that's the one that's the most closely based on me. But to be honest, I probably would not say that. Not least, I have a very self-deprecating sense of humor, and I'm not comfortable promoting myself, generally speaking, and that's why I'm quick to say I'm not an actual genius. I just played one on TV, and that I got that gig purely by luck. But so the Jeffrey character, who's mostly me, I think there's plenty of critical things. He's self-deprecating is going on there. The really compelling character, and ultimately the anchor of the book, I think, on some deep level, is the Jude character. The Jude character is he's heavy, he's dense, he's thoughtful, he's smart. He's the one who's going to get murdered, right? And so part of the story of the book is understanding these relationships, which you're invited to believe are going to help you understand the murder. So that might mean one or more of these characters are suspects in that later murder, right? You don't know, or one or more of these relationships might be the motive for that subsequent murder. So I think Jude, and Jude is there's one character who's sort of explicitly called the genius, the Czar character. Jude character is pretty clearly a genius too, in a very, very different way. So with that intelligence and that heaviness, and really the anchor of the story, I would say Jude is the most compelling character.
Wow, amazing. How do you approach historical fiction compared to other genres?
So thank you for that question. Your questions are wonderful, really impressive. So I have, are you counting a 1980s book as historical or not?
Yes.
You are. Okay. All right. Because 1980s is obviously not contemporary, but also not 17th century, because at least 1980s, I, and presumably many possible readers or members of my audience, we lived through that and we can remember it. So it's in the past, but not quite historical in the sense that a 17th century story is. So I'll first answer the question about the 17th century novel, which is called The Irrationalist, about René Descartes, whose work I studied, as I mentioned, but whose life I also studied. It was a very fascinating life. And in order to write that book, his life, he was a French philosopher, but as he said, he got basically kicked out of France by the Catholics. He got kicked out of the Netherlands by the Lutherans, and then he possibly got murdered in Sweden by the Calvinists. So that's he didn't say that because he would have been dead by the time he said that, but he had a lot of enemies. So in order to write that novel, I had to do so much research. I mean, it took probably 2 full years of just really studying the 17th century. There was a time when I could have probably told you every single battle of the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. And I probably did do that at more than one party that I didn't get invited back to. So I absolutely immersed myself, not just in the military and political and religious history of the 17th century, which, by the way, is really fascinating if you like that sort of stuff, but also in the everyday life of the 17th century, because I wanted this book to be very, very real. So that's how I did The Irrationalist. As far as my first novel, which is called The Second Daughter, and it's under the pen name of J period, like J initial, J Jeffrey. Now, if you've read Bright College Years, you might begin to realize that the Jeffrey character in Bright College Years is the J Jeffrey who is the author of The Second Daughter. So meta structure, right? Just beginning.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because that was going to be my next question to use.
We're mind readers here.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and that answers, if those of you who were wondering why the Jeffrey character in Bright College Years gets nicknamed Jeff, it turns out his name is Jeffrey, but you can't know that from Bright College Years. That gets revealed in The Second Daughter. The J Jeffrey is actually Jeffrey. He hates that, so he goes by J Jeffrey. But now in college, he's called Jeff for reasons that the reader can't know unless they happen to have read some of my other books. So you like the way I'm pulling people in here, or at least trying to.
I like that. Very clever.
Thank you. So that novel, as I said, was like from the 1950s to the 1980s, which a good chunk of that precedes my own experience. So I did a bunch of research again about like the 50s and 60s in particular to make it realistic. And finally, with respect to Bright College Years, bulk of which occurs, as we've said, in the early 1980s. I had my memory and my own stories to draw from, but I also did that other research. I actually, in addition to reading every edition of the student newspaper from 1980 to 1984, I also read through New York Times headlines from, not all of them, but from 1980 to 1984. And Wikipedia is pretty useful. You can, unlike Wikipedia, there'll be an article that says what happened in 1980, and it sort of takes you through the year. So I went through 1980 through 1984 and got lots of the real events to be reminded of, which are peppered in throughout the novel to help anchor this fictional story in its very real external context, what was going on in the world at the time. So the historical part, the next one I don't think will be historical because it's a lot of work. You have to do that research, it's fun research. But, you know, of the, I don't know, many hours I spent going just through Wikipedia, 1980 to 1984, you know, 5 or 6 little items make their way into the novel and most don't. So it's not necessarily time effective or cost effective research. But if I'm writing something in the 1980s, it has to be that. So the next novel, in which, by the way, I expect that the mystery of the murder will be solved, that will be contemporaneous so that I don't have to do that kind of research.
Look forward to that. How do you balance humor with the more serious, heart-wrenching moments
Thank
in
you.
your novels?
That is hard. You know, I set out to write this one, actually. All of my novels have humor in them, and I can't help myself. I've tried not to. And the humor, I don't know, it's who I am. The humor comes out, hopefully successful, maybe not always, but there's always at least attempts at humor in there. And I know, you know, Bright College Years, I set out to write a non-humorous thing, and that was not possible. And so I gave in, and it's humorous throughout, but there are, of course, some pretty heavy moments. I don't know that I have an explicit answer to that excellent question, other than to say, you know, as you're going by feeling and by passion as opposed to by logic, you realize certain scenes, the humor just turns off. It just happens quite naturally. The image or vision I have for that scene, or rather the feeling I'm trying to get across, does not produce humor. And so I think it's natural. I'm pretty sure I've decided to myself the next novel, I really want to just tone down not be humorous again, but I don't know that I'm capable of that, because once I start describing a scene or once I start developing a character, I sort of can't help myself, for better or for worse.
I can imagine that's very, very hard to control. Now, I couldn't help myself with the next question either. How does teaching philosophy influence your approach to writing fiction?
That's a great question. I think, you know, my first instinct is to separate the parts of the brain again, but on the other hand, then earlier I was distinguishing them and separating them. But I think there's also a sense in which they feed off each other, at least the way I teach philosophy, which is not necessarily the way other people approach it. It's actually very much telling a story. And yes, a philosophical argument has to have points made in a logical order, as I was saying earlier. But when you're teaching it, I mean, sometimes you just sort of lecture this point, that point, and here's why they go together. But other times you're trying to engage students in the process. And that is really a kind of storytelling. You try to lay out the issue or the question in a way that will get them interested and engage them and have them start responding to it. And I think in my mind, when I'm writing fiction, it's doing something very similar. I mean, I'm the first reader of the book, hopefully not the last, as I said earlier, but I'm imagining someone reading it and I'm trying to think, all right, well, what might draw them in? What might interest them? What might even engage them in various ways, whether it's rooting for the character, or, you know, not liking the character. If I have a character that shouldn't be liked, getting angry at the character or something like that. I think about, on that topic, the Beamy character, the one who's kind of a loser and he's trying to date, and, you know, spoiler alert, he comes out okay. So there's a happy ending for Beamer, or Beamy. But I thought I was trying to do something simultaneous with Beamy, which is both A, make fun of him for being a loser, but B, make you care for him and root for him and want him not to be a loser. And that that is challenging because the things that make him a loser also repel you. And the things that might want you to support him are non-loserly things. So you have to find that right balance. And I'm sure I didn't find it for everyone. I know my wife in particular, she didn't love the Beamy character initially because she felt he was like too much of a loser. Like it just, and she felt bad for him. It was like as if he was being mocked, and that gave her a bad feeling. So I don't know if I succeeded with my wife as a reader, but I know other people have said they love the Beamy character because he's funny in a loserly way, or he's a loser in a funny way, and you do start rooting for him. And I've had more than one person say to me that when he sort of gets his happy ending, they were so happy for him. And to me, that's a success. If they're really happy for him, it means they must have been feeling his pain along the way, and it was successful. So it's the same process when I'm teaching Descartes. I want to lay out the story in a way that might suck you into it a little bit, where you care. You care about the outcome. You care about the argument. You care about the conclusion. You care about the character, and you care about what happens to them. So despite the differences, logic versus emotion, there's something really similar, I think, in the process.
It was quite amusing hearing what your wife thinks. I always find that an interesting thing when the spouses react in different ways
right.
to your work than other people would.
Oh my gosh, yes.
They know you so much better.
Right.
But interestingly, I've interviewed an author who co-writes with her husband. Now that, I think you've got to be a very special human to do that.
And have a good divorce attorney or marital counselor or something. I'm the first reader. My wife is the second reader, and she's my worst critic. So so my feeling is if I can get the book, if I can still want to move forward with the book after her withering criticisms of it, then I know I'm in and I'm committed. And those criticisms are always helpful and productive. And like, she figures out what's wrong and it helps me to fix it. And sometimes we don't always agree. Like the Beamy character, the final version of it, that was kind of her response to it. Didn't love it. But because she was having that response in earlier drafts, I worked harder to make Beamy less a loser and a little bit more engaging and likable, right? So it was in response to that criticism. The one time, I am impressed by this couple that you just mentioned, but I will say that my historical murder mystery, The Irrationalist with Descartes, my wife actually had a crucial role in that. She helped me plot it. So like every night I would sort of come to bed and say, all right, here's where we are. What should happen next? And she was really good at developing the mystery aspects of that in saying, we need actually a new character here to threaten this guy. So, all right, great. I'll work that in, etc. So in that case, she played a crucial role in helping me plot the novel. And we had so much fun working on that together.
Did you credit her?
Maybe not. Should I have? I'll bring that up with our counselor. Maybe that's why she's been so mad for the last 5 years. Yeah,
sorry, I couldn't resist throwing that in.
No, it was wonderful. No, my wife does not like the limelight, so she would never have wanted her name on it, even if I had thought of it. What I should say is I offered and she declined. But yeah, it was a lot of fun to do that. I will say this novel was a little bit more complex for us as a couple. I probably shouldn't share this, but hey, we're all in now. Because this novel is about a character reflecting back on his college girlfriend. And that, and the girlfriend character is completely different from my actual main college girlfriend. But nevertheless, if Jeffrey was me, the girlfriend of Jeffrey in the novel must be her, which even though she was completely different, the character was extremely different from her. So that was like a new challenge for my wife's and I, very wonderful and very strong relationship, which is for her to be reading a story in which I seem to be reflecting back on the complexities of my college relationship. So there were new challenges there, which I believe we have conquered.
Very interesting.
I think we have conquered adequately.
Very interesting. Did you have any, this is always an interesting question for me to get an answer to because every author is different. Do you have any input into your covers?
I have some input. I've been working with this small independent publisher called Open Books, and they're very wonderful people and very easy to work with. They typically, actually 3 of my novels are with them, and I think they're talented creatively. So they usually give me 2 or 3 covers to look at and ask for my input. And so this one was actually very easy because the image on the cover of the book, which I don't know if you can see it there, but yeah, that image there, I'm pretty sure if it isn't.
Can you hold it up again? It's such a gorgeous cover.
Thank you. And I will convey that to them. But I am 98% sure, I think I asked, that is actually a photo of Yale University. Or if it isn't, it's indistinguishable from Yale University. So they've really, and it's in particular the freshman quad at Yale University, which is where obviously a chunk of the novel occurs. So it's the perfect cover, and it captures the feeling of that sort of that college campus very, very beautifully. So I saw this one. It was like, yep, that's the one. Let's go with that. So so they're nice. They give me some feedback, but they do the main creative work.
Yeah.
On the cover.
What are your thoughts on the evolving landscape of college life? We're talking about hindsight from the 1980s to today, seeing as
I'm still there.
You're still there.
So yeah, without taking us in uncharted directions, my previous novel just a couple of years ago was this academic satire about colleges having gone crazy in the ways that I'm sure many of your readers, if you follow the headlines and see what's going on colleges, they've gone a little crazy in certain ways. So that novel is sort of specifically about that phenomenon. As I was writing this novel, I had it in the back of my mind to develop a contrast between how things were then, at least in my nostalgic, rosy memory of them, and how things are now. So there's a number of things. There's like points in this novel where people say things and the narrator says, you could say that then, right? Like, because those sorts of things today, you can't say, whatever those things might be. So it was meant to serve as a kind of contrast. And when I was trying to at least focus on, in my experience, and what I think is a fairly common experience that a lot of people who were in residential colleges in the early 80s, there's a lot of real learning and education going on, not just in the classroom, but maybe even more so outside the classroom, in particular through the relationships that you develop with your peers on those campuses. And there's also, these characters, they're into partying. So there's quite a few party activities, including some drug and alcohol use, and they're having sex. Some of them would not be me so much, but the other ones are having sex, etc. So like there's this very full life, but it's balanced by the education and the intellectual thing. Like you start to realize, you don't see it so much freshman year, but as you go through, freshman year is a little bit more about the social aspects and the friendships and the episodes and the incidents and the hijinks and things like that. But you begin to realize as you get deeper into the novel that at the same time, these people are going to classes and they're actually learning stuff. And some of them are doing actually excellent, important work. And one of them is going to be a future Nobel laureate, as it turns out, et cetera, et cetera. So like this absolute commitment to the education somehow fused with the social life and the bonding and the friendships. To me, that's what college was like in the 1980s very much. And as far as I can see, it's much less like that now. There's a lot more, and again, we don't have to go this direction, but there's a lot more. And it's not that things were apolitical back then, but there's political ideology and activism seem front and center in a way that I don't think it was earlier. And I think that has to some degree corrupted the educational process. We have professors who are activists and not just educators. I don't think that was present, certainly not in anywhere near the same degree back in the 80s. And so it allowed people really to pursue an education while also pursuing the social life in a way that's not. You could also have honest and open discussions, and that's where it fuses. Like these characters, they talk, right? They talk a lot. And this is true, one of the professors has a sign on his door saying, "Sit long, talk much," which is that was a true sign on a professor's door. And I've always loved that because that captures like the college experience with the professor inviting you to come in, sit long, talk much. That is like the essence of the educational process. These group of friends, whether it's, at the dining table or at their parties or wherever they're hanging out, they're talking, they're debating, and they're unfettered and unself-conscious in these conversations in a way that's not possible on a 21st century campus anymore. Now we have a lot of people censoring themselves and being very cautious about what they say and cautious about what they think, lest they begin offending people or, ending up on the wrong side of whatever is politically correct, etc. So I think that's an important way that the college experience has changed, not for the better, at least from my perspective. And this novel's making that point indirectly by trying to show what it used to be like.
We're at the top of the hour. I cannot believe we've
that went fast.
an hour together. It's crazy. So I'm going to end with one question, and if you can answer that in under a minute, that'll be great.
All right.
What advice would you give to an aspiring author trying to find their unique voice in writing? And I'm asking this because you're a professor and you're a good writer.
Thank you. 1 minute, not thank you. Okay. So, all right. So it's what advice would I offer? Was that? Yeah. So
yeah. What advice would you offer?
I think to me, I've never seriously suffered from writer's block with fiction, because what I realize is it's never the final draft, right? You can always change it and revise it. And so it's essentially important in those earlier drafts to just open the floodgates and let it out, and don't even think about what you're writing. And don't worry, it doesn't have to be good, because 99% of it's going to get cut or changed or whatever. But when you open those floodgates and just write whatever comes to mind, stream of consciousness for a while in these early drafts, I think you'll find your voice. That's how I find my voice. That's why the humor comes out, because that's part of who I am, for better or for worse. And so it's just literally unfettered, free thinking stream of consciousness onto the blank page. And once you've got that, you'll find the voice, you'll find the thing you really want to write about in there, and then you can focus on developing it explicitly and consciously.
Fantastic. Andrew, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Goodness. I can't believe how quickly this hour went by.
It sure did.
It was great talking to you, and, we'd love to have you back again for your next book.
Thank you.
And to our amazing audience out there, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on the next episode of Books with Bridgetti. Take care, Andrew, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us on Books with Bridgetti. Join us next time for industry experts and award-winning authors.
I think this might be, I've been on over 24 different podcasts and radio shows in the last couple of months. And this has to be one of the most sophisticated, what the kids I used to teach called bomb.com shows and presentations that I've ever been on. It's fantastic. Thank you for having me here.
Available wherever great books are sold near you.